Welcome to the Connection Point podcast, where we are actively working to find common ground in the lives of people doing similar work in different communities, one conversation at a time. I am your host, Amber Mayer, and I will serve as the facilitator of the dialogue that will take place during the Macro 3 series. So I'm currently serving as an intern for my social work department at Trinity Christian College. I'm in my last semester of undergrad. I'll be graduating with my BSW in December, and it has been such a journey to be in this internship. So basically, what it looks like is there's a program called Macro 3 that our social work professors have created for senior social work students to be able to learn about macro level social work. And because I am a winter graduate, it just made sense to have me in this internship for a variety of reasons that we'll be able to talk about later in this episode. So my guest for today is my internship supervisor, my social work professor, Allison Tan. She is the assistant professor of social work at Trinity Christian College, who recently and formerly served as the president of NACSW. And it's been such a joy to have her as both a mentor and a supervisor in my internship. So we're going to bring her in to describe a little bit about what the Macro 3 program is, some of the work that we're able to do as a social work community, and how that work has impacted both us as students and also the Harvey community. So hi, Allison.
Hi, Amber. Thanks for having me.
Of course, my pleasure. It is so exciting to have you on this platform with me. So I'm basically just going to have a conversation with you about Macro 3 and about some of the work that we're doing in the Macro 3 program at Trinity. So if you could define the Macro 3 program, what would you say?
Yeah, so the Macro 3 really came about. So we call it the Macro 3 because they are three separate classes. And so they are three classes that are taken by our social work seniors in their senior semester. And all three of these classes, they're three separate classes taught by three separate professors, actually. But all three of them are focused on a particular aspect of the macro level of social work practice. So those three classes are Community Social Action Policy, which is a class that focuses on policy, obviously, but also just kind of the idea of like civic engagement more broadly. And then there is a class on organizational leadership and development. And so that class allows students to learn about leadership and nonprofit management and grant writing and what it means to kind of be involved at the nonprofit level. And then the third class, which is the class that I teach, is our social work practice with communities class. And that is the class that is the home to most of the work that we'll probably talk about in today's episode. And that class utilizes a model called the Asset-Based Community Development, or ABCD, as a way to understand communities. So we call them the Macro 3 because they're these three separate classes. And, I do also just want to say from the onset that this is really a unique BSW level learning experience that students at Trinity have that most other BSW programs don't offer. So Trinity's BSW program definitely has a heavier macro emphasis than kind of the traditional BSW program does. So most BSW students have one, maybe two macro classes kind of sprinkled into the curriculum. But this sort of senior level emphasis on macro social work is something that's pretty unique to Trinity's program. And we really designed it to be highly experiential. So we have a really strong commitment to experiential learning. And early on when we were the Macro 3 has been in existence for about 4 years. And 4 years ago, when we were sort of starting to develop it, we even toyed with the idea of calling it a pre-field experience, because essentially that's what it is. Like, these three classes are usually the last semester before our students go into doing their field internships, kind of out in the real world. And in a lot of ways, we've really built this experience to be a pre-field experience. where they spend the overwhelming majority of their time, not in a classroom, but physically in a community. In this case, the community of Harvey.
That's awesome. I love it. I loved the Macro 3 program when I was in it. I saw some of my best academic work in Macro 3, and that is clearly what inspired me to be in this internship, as well as the community that is being served in the Macro 3 program, which is Harvey, Illinois, my hometown. So, Allison, can you tell me a little bit about why you guys chose to serve the Harvey community?
Yeah, absolutely. So this actually isn't even something that the social work department can claim that we started, because we didn't. We landed in Harvey because about 4 years ago, maybe actually 5 years ago, there is a class that is taught in our nursing program at Trinity that's called I think it's called community nursing. If that's not true, I'm sorry, nursing department. But it is sort of a macro community level class in the nursing program. And at the time, it was being taught by Professor Steffo, and Catherine Steffo, had a really strong connection to Restoration Ministries in Harvey. And so the nursing students were doing a lot of work in the Harvey community, mostly setting up health fairs and things like that in the Harvey community to address, obviously, healthcare issues. And at one point, Catherine Steffo invited the social work department to kind of team up on those health fairs. And so she contacted us and said, hey, my nursing students do this kind of stuff. Would your social work students want to, partner with us and help us run these health fairs and things like that? So we initially started working in Harvey, kind of just tagging along with the nursing students. And in some ways, it was a great experience. Those health fairs were really, really fun and a great way to kind of, really get to interact with a lot of different people in Harvey. But I think what we experienced in that partnership was, in some ways, it was a really natural partnership, because nursing and social work are both helping professions, and we had a lot in common. But as we sort of settled into that partnership, we realized that there are also some pretty fundamental differences between the way a community like Harvey looks when you look at it through a nursing lens versus the way it looks when you look at it through a social work lens. And so we decided, if we were going to continue this partnership in Harvey, that we needed to add some things to our social work curriculum to make sure that our social work students were engaging with Harvey residents the right way. And that's sort of where the model, the infusion of the asset-based community development model came in.
Awesome. That's incredible. How has this program changed with having an intern?
Well, I mean, an intern like you, because you're so great. So Amber, you were actually our second intern. So we had 2 years of the Macro 3 program where there wasn't an internship associated with it. And then last year, for the first time, we had an intern. And then Amber, you're our second intern. And I think that the addition of the internship was really actually important, because it as we continued to kind of delve into the Harvey community, as this experience became even more experiential, we did 2 things. One, we added an internship, and 2, we made all of these courses hybrid courses, meaning that we recognized that so much of the work that students were doing, we were asking them to do actually in the community. And so that meant less time in the classroom. So we transitioned them to hybrid classes. The problem is faculty members are limited by all of the other things that we are responsible for. And so we weren't always able to be out in the community with our students. So we added the internship so that the intern can kind of be the liaison in between. And so our intern last year, and then obviously, Amber, the work that you've been doing this semester, although COVID impacted. So we can talk about that, but that's even a little more interesting. But the way we utilize the intern is that we really lean pretty heavily into the intern's ability to physically be in Harvey, making connections, a lot of networking and connections, and then also helping our students to find and interact with the right people in Harvey. So it's been a really, really important addition to the experiential learning component for our students.
That's
I don't know,
awesome.
is that fair? How you describe your internship experience?
I would say, yeah, I would say a lot of the same things you said, serving as that kind of in-between liaison between the faculty members and the students, and being able to like give insight to the students, being someone who went through the Macro 3 program myself, but also being able to provide like suggestions and insight to the professors and when they have questions about like maybe something they don't understand from a student's perspective, if you will. So being able to be that bridge in between has been really cool and has worked out really well this semester, actually, in light of COVID, which is where we're going to jump to next. So, how do you think COVID-19 has impacted the work that the students have been able to do this semester?
Yeah, so I think that in some ways we are sad and grieving a little bit the ways in which this semester's experience has been different. And we've heard from several students who have said, "Man, I was just so looking forward to this Macro 3 experience and the work in Harvey, and I'm really sad that like we weren't able to actually be in Harvey as much." And so I think we're all sort of grieving that a little bit. But I'll tell you that the most valuable lesson for me that's come out of seeing how this all unfolded in a more virtual way is that I think it taught us the importance of engagement as the first step of the helping process. So in social work, I'm sorry, I'm a social work professor, so I got to lecture at you a little bit. So in social work, when we talk about the helping profession, we talk about four steps: engage, assess, intervene, evaluate. Right, and engagement is the first step in that helping process. And I think what we learned this semester is because of all of the ways that we were limited in our ability to do the on the ground immersive type of engagement that ABCD model calls for, because we were limited in our ability to do that, we were also limited in our ability to accurately assess the community. And there was a moment where I panicked as sort of the professor of the class and thought, oh gosh, now what do we do? And but in the pivot, I hope that what students were able to see is a reminder that will stick with them, that you can't jump to assessing a community, and you certainly can't jump to deciding what interventions a community needs if you have not successfully engaged the client, in this case, the community, right? So I think it's really taught us something important about, it's an important reminder about how important building rapport and engaging clients and communities is to the work that social work does. The ABCD model is it's a very asset-based model, which means it's a very immersive experience. And so we can't identify and assess the assets of a community without really taking the time to like engage the community well. So in some ways, I'm sad our students didn't have the ability to do that, at least as much as they normally would. But I also think that taught us a lesson that hopefully will stick with us, right? As they go into whatever their internships are going to be for next semester.
Yeah. Yes, social worker. That's good stuff. So one of the assignments that was switched around this semester was the community walk that the students do. Can you talk a little bit about what the community walk is and how we adapted it this semester?
Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about what it normally is, and then you tell them what you did.
Oh, okay.
So I'm still your professor, so you're interviewing me. I still get to tell you what to do.
Okay.
So normally one of the first big assignments in this macro 3 process is to do what we call a community walk, which is essentially that it's they go out in their groups into Harvey. They walk the streets of the community. Sometimes they, drive, walk, stop into agencies, whatever you have to do. But it really is just that sort of like initial field trip to Harvey, visit to Harvey, to make observations about the community. And so obviously, this semester, because Trinity was largely virtual this semester, many of our students weren't necessarily living locally, combined with sort of the challenges and precautions to be taken with COVID. They were not able to do a community drive / walk of Harvey. And so as I was kind of thinking about how do we recreate that, I realized that assignment's still really important. And so we couldn't just completely eliminate it because they need an initial introduction to the Harvey community. And so I asked Amber to do it. So tell them what you did.
Okay, so Allison came to me and said, hey, the students can't go into Harvey. We can't make students who are local go into Harvey, and we need to figure out a creative way to introduce them to the Harvey community. So what I did was I got myself a little video camera and asked my best friend to go to Harvey with me and videotape some things. And we went and we drove through the community and we got video of what the community looked like and some of the exterior of the Harvey community. I interviewed about 3 people in the Harvey community who are in positions of power, not power, that's a really bad way to say it, but who are community leaders in Harvey. And I interviewed them about their Harvey experience and how it shapes the work that they do. Currently, I was able to get a meal in Harvey and show them some of the best tacos in the world from Taco Taco. And it was basically just me sharing my hometown.
Did you just shout out Taco Taco on your podcast?
I absolutely did because they deserve all the love. I will link the business in the podcast.
Support local business because COVID, girl, and times are tough.
Absolutely. But yeah, it was basically me just saying, here's my hometown. And like not even from like an intern perspective, but me going into my hometown and saying, here's where I grew up, here's the place that made me the woman I am today, and here are some of the people who have been impacting my life in positive ways while I've been on this journey. So apparently that went really well because I got a really good response from that video. It was about a 45-minute long video that was somewhat comprised of interviews, me just talking about what I know of the Harvey community, some statistics and things like that. Yeah, it was a really fun project to do. It was time consuming, but also like time flies when you're having fun, right? So like it didn't feel like my first internship project, if you will. So yeah, I enjoyed it a lot. It was good.
Well, and I think what I would say about the one almost unintended consequence of the shift in having you create that video at that point in the semester was that I think there was something very powerful, like you said, about us getting an opportunity to see your hometown of Harvey through your eyes. And that gave you an opportunity to model for the students what it looks like to view a community through an asset-based lens, because that's the way you see your community.
Mm-hmm.
And the Harvey that you introduced us to in that video, it was honest, and it was the same Harvey they would have seen if they had driven through, but interpreted through your lens. And I think that was really, really important for our students. That that asset-based community development perspective is a lens that's very social worky, but it's not necessarily the lens that Trinity students initially view Harvey through. By the end of the semester, by halfway through the semester, I hope we've gotten them to that place. But oftentimes, that first community walk assignment for students tends to be a little, in the past, it has been a little bit of a shock factor. And instead, you were able to introduce us to Harvey in a much more positive light from the beginning. And I think that honestly helped the experience this semester.
Yeah. I like that. I never thought about it that way. So, in addition to my community walk video, the students also had an assignment that they had to do in their communities as well. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so then what I asked the students to do was to do community walks of their own home communities. And in part to then allow them to compare and contrast their own home communities and the observations that they made with what they saw in your video and heard from you. And then I think you were able to kind of have some follow-up conversations with them. And so, yeah, I know a little bit about those conversations, but how do you think that went?
Yeah, so I came up with this crazy idea to do a one-to-one meeting with each of the macro students to ask about their community walk experience because they were able to see my community, but I wasn't able to see all of their communities, And I just felt like reading the community walk papers wouldn't do it for me. So I took the extra mile to say like, hey, let's schedule a meeting to really talk about what your experience is like in your community. So what I did was I had 2 questions prepared to ask the students on the Zoom call, the FaceTime, the coffee date, whatever it was we decided to do. So we're going to talk about some of the responses to some of the questions I asked. Mm-hmm. So the first question I asked all of the students was, how did the ABCD model shape how you approached your community for this assignment? And let me just pause for a second because I didn't know what to expect in these responses, because I didn't know like where the students were from until I asked like, hey, what is your home community and where are you from and what place did you do your community walk video? So I had no idea like what I was getting myself into by asking that question alone. I also didn't want to assume that the students were going to look at their communities from an asset-based lens because that's not the work they're being asked to do. They're just being asked to go into their communities honestly and reflect on that experience. So I got some notable responses and I'll share a couple of them and we'll have some dialogue with some follow-up from those responses. So one of the notable responses I got was that many students talked about approaching their community with a strengths-based perspective versus a needs-based perspective, which is basically saying like, I'm not going to go in looking for community deficits and what's wrong with the community and what needs to be changed about community. Instead, I'm going to go in saying, here's what stands out in this community and here are some of the strengths that lie in the place where I come from. So a question I have for you, Allison, is how does this perspective shift help the students as they are diving into the community work? And what will they gain from viewing the communities from a strengths-based perspective versus a needs-based perspective?
Yeah. So, like I said, I think, we chose the asset-based community development model to teach in the macro 3. So first of all, asset-based community development it doesn't originate in the field of social work, but it is very social worky. Because what does originate in the field of social work is the strengths-based perspective, right? And so it resonates with a lot of how we want students to view the world. But I think the other interesting thing about training ourselves to look at any community from a strengths-based perspective is I think that then what students find is it can actually be helpful because it gives you a place to start in terms of intervention. Because asset-based community development says we identify what resources and assets and strengths already exist in a community. And then we just build on what that community already has, right? In some ways, that should take the burden off of social workers because we don't have to create interventions. We just have to help clients and communities live into what's already there, right? Um, and so especially for new social workers, brand new BSWs, I hope that that's a tool that they can really see benefiting them. If whether it's looking at an individual client through their strengths or a community through their strengths, that it really says our role is just to help people live their best lives with what they already have. Um, and that means we always have a starting place. Um, and so yeah, so I hope that that's what they find. But I think especially in the work that we do in Harvey in the course of this semester, I think there's some light bulb moments that happened around that when they realized this is a very different way to engage a community, to say like what's already really strong here and then how do we use that to make things even better, right?
Yeah, that's good. So because students went to their communities with this perspective, they were able to easily name organizations or people in their communities who did astounding work, and they used those to snowball other assets. So one example that I remember is a student talking about how in their home community there is a homeless shelter. Even though their community is somewhat wealthier, they're still able to give to people in their community who don't have the resources they need. And because of that, people are starting to give more and donate more of what they have so that other people are able to get the resources they need in neighboring communities, which is super cool. So what I really appreciated about asking the students that question was that they were able to easily say, like, I know my community is not perfect. And Harvey also, as my home community, is not perfect. But here's how people are working to make a change in this community. And here's how we're able to identify some of those assets is through the people who are doing that work. Like how you were talking about in Harvey, Restoration Ministries has been in Harvey for years and has done so much work to help people in many different population groups and who have different issues and social problems that they are facing in their lives. So that has been super cool to hear from the students. And that was a lesson I had to learn about Harvey a year ago. Because when we were told that we were going to be doing Macro 3 in Harvey, I was so scared because I was just like, I know my life story and I know what my experience was like living in Harvey. And it doesn't come from that asset-based model. So none of my experience was asset-based in Harvey, but being able to go in now as a social work student and say, okay, let me shift my perspective and maybe things will be a little different for me. Now here I am as an intern, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's super cool to see how the tables have turned in such a short amount of time, but also to see students having those same light bulb moments as I did is also super cool as an intern. So yeah. Um, so the second question I asked the macro students was, how would you compare your home community to the Harvey community? Which is super vague. I didn't mean to ask them such a vague question, but I also wanted to have enough open space for them to respond freely to this question. And I love some of the responses I got. So for the first one, many of the communities students reside in are known to be affluent communities, which are more wealthy communities, unlike Harvey, which is seen as an under-resourced and at-risk community. So Allison and I both have issues with the phrase at risk.
So many issues.
So Allison, can you begin to talk a little bit about your experience with this phrase and why you despise it?
Yeah, so it's been a real journey. And I feel like maybe we got somewhere this semester. But it's been a real journey as a social work educator and kind of an academic and caring deeply about community level practice, doing most of my social work practice experience was on the west side of Chicago in a community very much like Harvey. And I have always struggled for my whole professional life, have always struggled with like what we call communities like that, right? Because we've heard communities like this referred to as income communities, impoverished communities, high-risk communities, at-risk communities, right? Under-resourced communities, disadvantaged communities. And all I didn't know what I wanted to call these communities. I just knew I didn't like any of those terms. And Amber and I have had many conversations about that, where we don't know what we do like. We just know all of those terms hit us the wrong way, right? Make us feel not great, and certainly don't sound at all in line with the social work values and lens that we're trying to teach students, right? We're trying to teach students to view communities through an asset-based lens and to focus on strengths. And then we call communities at-risk communities and disadvantaged communities. And there was always a disconnect there for me. I just didn't have a better term. I still don't have a better term necessarily. But what I do know is, it wasn't until I always knew that those terms hit me the wrong way and didn't feel like my definition of social work. But it was when I started teaching the asset-based community development model and applying it to Harvey that I started to have some light bulb moments about some of the real reasons I don't like those terms. And so if we take like just two of them, right? Like we think about like referring to communities like this as disadvantaged communities, right? And I was like, no. Like the more I get to know Harvey, right? In the same way that when I worked on the west side in North Lawndale, I would have said the same thing, right? The more I got to know North Lawndale, Harvey has advantages. Harvey has strengths. It's not a disadvantaged community. And so and similarly, right? Like we for a while we landed on that term under-resourced. And Amber, I remember even for a while you and I were like, yeah, under-resourced. That's better. And it is better than at-risk communities. Like I agree it's a better term.
Mm-hmm.
But then we get into Harvey and we start unpacking all of the assets in the Harvey community. And I realized this is not an under-resourced community. There are tons of resources in this community. In some ways, it's a highly resourced community, maybe more so than some of those quote unquote affluent communities, right, that our students come from. Mm-hmm. And so then I started wrestling with what is the better term? Why do we refer to communities like this as under-resourced communities? And I think it has something to do not with the number of resources in a community, but the type of resources and how utilized those resources are. And so, yeah, but it's not that they don't have resources. And so, sure, at risk is a terrible term because who wants to tell someone they're at risk? That's not an affirming phrase in any way, right? Yeah. Either are some of these other terms. I don't know. Do you remember anything about those conversations you and I used to have and what you thought about them?
Absolutely. I remember in book club last year, because after we do our presentations, we dig into a book together as a class. And I think me and you sat and went back and forth about the term under-resourced and how we felt about that versus at risk for about 10 minutes. And some of the students engaged with us, but other students were like, what are they talking about?
That's really true. They're just listening in on Amber and I's personal book club.
It was great. So I'm glad that you mentioned all of that, because that goes into my second point about this question, which is the accessibility to resources. Students in their community shared that they are easily able to identify and utilize different resources offered to members of their communities, while Harvey's resources aren't utilized as often due to the lack of accessibility. So it really goes back to you saying that it's not that Harvey doesn't have resources, it's just that people aren't tapping into those resources because either they don't know about them or they just choose not to, which is also totally okay. But I know that in Harvey, at many of the institutions that are there, such as the school districts, the park district, the library, restoration ministries, the boxing club, etc., there are huge bulletin boards filled with resources about transportation, jobs, COVID-19, food pantries and food banks, where you can go to church on Sundays, where to take your kids if they need childcare. You know what I mean? So I think that we need to shift the conversation out of Harvey being an under-resourced community versus like how to maximize those resources. Because I think that's more of an issue than saying like, yeah, Harvey doesn't have any resources, because that's not true. So yeah, thank you for sharing that, and thank you for your perspective in that. I'm glad someone understands where I've been coming from my whole life, because I know when I lived in Harvey, it was commonly referred to as the hood. And it's not that there aren't some characteristics that would help perpetuate that stereotype, but Harvey's not a hood. You know what I mean? Harvey is a community. Harvey is a city in the south suburbs that once thrived. You know what I mean? And if there are people who would change their perspective out of what deficits existed in Harvey, they would be able to see the many community leaders who give their hours and their time and their resources into making Harvey a better place, which is a conversation for another podcast episode. For now, I'll move on. The final point for this question that students shared was that they identified the culture of Harvey's community members, stating that Harvey is a strong community made up of people who put in work to make Harvey better, which is what essentially I just said. Many of the students resonated with this, stating that they see similar qualities in their communities as well. So I've been able to connect with tons of people in the Harvey community who serve as Harvey community leaders, who put in their time and efforts to make Harvey a better place. And many of them will be on the podcast later in this series, which I'm excited about. But Allison, can you tell me a little bit about some of the interactions you've had with Harvey community leaders?
Yeah, so, in some ways I haven't had as much interaction in the last year or two because the interns have kind of taken on that work, right? But especially towards the beginning of this work, we spent a summer, 2 summers ago, the social work faculty, the 3 of us, spent the summer making connections in the Harvey community and having lots of these kind of meetings with community leaders. Part of what I think has been really interesting, and that I'm interested in continuing to see, but this year in particular, one of the things that's really interesting is that lots of Harvey's leadership turned over, right? They have a new mayor. They have all kinds of new aldermen. It's kind of a whole new shift in Harvey leadership at the kind of highest elected levels. And so we're looking forward to kind of continuing to make connections with some of those new leaders. But Trinity also, for years, has had partnerships with restoration ministries and some of those other community partners. And so we've always leaned pretty heavily. We have a social work internship at Restoration most semesters. And so we do a lot of work with them as well. But yeah, I think that's the fun of this Macro 3 from year to year is every year we find new community leaders to partner with, right? We just sort of keep adding them to our, directories of folks for our students to connect with.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, there are some Harvey community leaders who I've known since I've been in diapers, and there are some who I met for the first time 3 weeks ago. And I think the commonality between all of those people is that they've been consistent and they've been dedicated to serving the Harvey community, which has been so so inspiring for me as someone who's going into the social work field, who's also from Harvey, who wants to see Harvey be better and do better. So I've often wrestled with the question of, does my work in Harvey end on December 19th when I graduate, or will there be something more for me once I have a degree in my hands and I'm able to do more? So I guess we'll see in the future where that goes. Thank you for your expertise, Allison, and for sharing. We will continue the rest of this series by bringing leaders from both the Trinity and Harvey communities together to create space for them to share their lived experience and how that impacts the work they do in their respective communities. And that is where we will introduce the research question. So, a little bit about me. I tend to believe I'm not good at research. And Allison and I talk about this often because she believes that that is not true. So I do have a research question that I am incorporating into this podcast, and it's super casual. It's not like, I'm not a scientist. I don't know what I'm doing. I have done research on what to do. So there we go. We're getting somewhere. So next week, I will be introducing the research question, and I will be having two guests here to engage in that research question using their Harvey experience and their Trinity experiences. Thank you, Allison, for being our guest for today. I really appreciate you and your insight. It has been a joy working with you. You're literally the reason why I'll have a social work degree, because you told me that I should be in social work. And so I did it.
Good. And we're so proud of you. You're going to be a great social worker.
Thank you. It's going to be great. Episodes are available every Friday morning at 11 a.m. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Connection Point podcast, and I hope you're able to join us next week. Boom! Solid. My computer's on 5%.
You're like, and the scene.
I'm really glad.
You're not plugged in?
So I'm an idiot, and I just assumed.
Wait, no, you need